300-day-old chicks sat stacked in cardboard crates on the loading dock behind Vandermeer Hatchery on a cold Tuesday in the first week of April, and every one of them was, by the hatchery's own accounting, already worthless. Which was a strange thing to be true of something that was still breathing, still cheeping, still shoving against its crate mates for a warmer spot in the middle of the pile. But that was the specific kind of worthless the hatchery meant. The kind that had nothing to do with whether a thing was alive, and everything to do with whether it fit anybody's plan for it. They were cockerels, male chicks, out of the white leghorn layer flock, and a male chick from a laying strain does not lay eggs, and does not grow out fast enough or fat enough to be worth the feed a broiler house would spend on it, and so for as long as Vandermeer Hatchery had been in business, going back to 1975, the unwanted males had been sorted out on the very first day of their lives and destroyed quietly, out of sight, the way a lot of ordinary business gets done out of sight so that nobody has to look at it while they eat breakfast. That had worked for the hatchery for decades until the past autumn, when a county health inspection and a complaint from a neighboring property about the smell and the noise of the old disposal method had put a stop to it. And now the hatchery had a standing problem it did not know how to solve. 300 to 400 live, healthy, unwanted male chicks arriving every single week with nowhere sanctioned left to put them. Amos Byler heard about the problem the way most things reached him, secondhand, through a neighbor who had heard it from a driver who delivered feed to both the hatchery and the Byler farm, and he had driven his flatbed wagon into town behind his gelding, Duke, on a morning cold enough that his breath showed, to see about it himself, before anyone else got there first. Roy Tanner was already on the dock when Amos arrived, standing beside his idling truck with a clipboard in his hand, because Tanner broilers bought pullet chicks from Vandermeer by the thousands every season, and Roy Tanner was, by any measure the county used, the man who knew poultry best in that part of Ashcombe County. 40 years in the business, 3 broiler houses holding 20,000 birds apiece, and an opinion on everything with feathers that he did not wait to be asked for. He watched Amos climb down off the wagon and walk toward the stacked crates with the particular attention of a man checking on something before he had agreed to take it, and Roy Tanner said, loud enough for the hatchery manager and 2 hired men to hear it, that Amos was fixing to feed nickel birds dollar feed, and that kind of math did not work out for anybody, not even for a man who didn't pay for electricity or diesel. Amos did not answer him. He crouched by the nearest crate instead and lifted one chick free with 2 fingers under its belly, the way his grandfather had taught him 50 years before Amos was ever born, feeling the weight of it, the spread of its wing buds, the thickness of the leg bone under the down, and he noticed something the hatchery manager mentioned only after Amos asked why the birds looked heavier through the shank than a leghorn chick should, which was that a pen of barred rock roosters, a heavier dual-purpose breed kept for a county fair display, had gotten loose into the white leghorn breeding house the previous spring, and this hatch, along with a few others, was not pure leghorn stock at all, but a cross nobody had planned, and nobody wanted, doubly worthless in the hatchery's ledger, because it wasn't even a clean loss. It was a mixed-up loss. Amos said he would take all of them, the whole week's cull, 300 birds. For the price of the gas it would have cost the hatchery to haul them to the rendering plant, which came to $11, and Roy Tanner laughed. Not unkindly, exactly, the way a man laughs when he has already decided how a story is going to end and is enjoying getting there early. And he said that Amos was welcome to them, and that he'd be interested to see what the man was still saying about it come August. Amos loaded the crates onto the wagon bed himself, stacking them the way he stacked hay, low and even, and settled the horse blanket over the top 2 rows to cut the wind, and he did not answer Roy Tanner then either, only nodded once to the hatchery manager, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and drove home with 300 unwanted lives behind him and $11 less in his pocket, while the men on the dock watched him go, and one of the hired men asked Roy Tanner what that was going to turn into, and Roy Tanner said he honestly could not wait to find out. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Amos Byler was 39 years old that April, and he had been farming the same 60 acres north of Fenwick Mills in Ashcombe County since he was a boy, following his father across the same fields with a hoe too tall for him. The farm had come down through 3 generations of Bylers, plain people, old order, who kept their calendar by church Sundays and their fields by the moon and their accounts by hand in ledgers that never left the house, and who had watched the county fill in around them over 60 years with modern operations, broiler houses, hog confinements, grain elevators with lights that ran all night, none of which the Bylers had ever wanted for themselves, and none of which they judged their English neighbors for wanting either. Amos's grandfather, Eli Byler, had built the farmhouse and the first barn in 1958, the same year he married, and had run a small mixed operation, a few milk cows, hogs, a market garden, and for a handful of years in the late 1960s, a chicken business that nobody in the family talked about much anymore because it had ended, as most small-side businesses on a plain farm eventually do, when the man who ran it got too old to keep at it, and nobody young enough was ready to take it over yet. Amos's father, Jonas Byler, had kept dairy cows instead, 40 of them at the operation's peak, and had run the farm steadily, and without much comment for 4 decades until he died the previous December of pneumonia that came on fast in a cold snap and took him inside of 9 days, a loss Amos did not talk about with anyone outside his own kitchen, and did not intend to start now. 3 years before that, Amos had lost his wife, Ruth, to a fever that the English doctors in town were never able to properly name before it took her, and that was a thing Amos also did not talk about. Not because he had made a rule of it, but because there was nothing useful to say about it that would change what had happened. And useful was the only kind of speech Amos put much stock in. What he had, in the spring the chicks came, was 60 acres, a 10-year-old son named Levy, a herd of dairy cows he had sold off in February, because milking alone with a boy for help had proven to be more than 2 hands could manage well, and a farm income that had gone thin enough over the winter that Amos had started doing figures at the kitchen table after Levi was asleep, the same figures over and over, looking for a place where the numbers might come out differently than they had the last time he added them. Fenwick Mills was not a large town, 1,100 people counting the farms around it, and it ran on the kind of local economy where a feed store, a hardware store, and a diner counter did most of the talking for everybody else, which meant that whatever a man did on his own 60 acres became common knowledge inside a week, whether he wanted it known or not. Amos had grown up understanding that about his community the way he understood weather, a condition to be worked around rather than argued with, and he had never once in his life tried to get ahead of a rumor by explaining himself before anyone asked him a direct question. What he needed that spring was not a rumor to manage. He needed something to sell that did not require electricity, did not require a truck, and did not require capital he did not have. And as he unloaded 300 unwanted chicks into the old milk house that same afternoon, warmed by a wood stove with the damper set low, he was not yet sure that what he had just done was the answer to that problem, or simply one more mouth to feed on a farm already stretched thin, and he told himself, setting the last crate down, that he would know more once he had thought about it properly, which for Amos meant reading before he acted, always, on anything that mattered. He did his thinking that night, after Levi had gone up to bed, sitting at his father's roll-top desk in the front room, going through the drawers his father had left mostly untouched for years, looking for the dairy ledgers he needed to close out the winter accounts, and what he found instead, wedged behind a stack of seed catalogs from 3 springs back, was a leather-bound journal with a cracked spine and his grandfather Eli's handwriting inside it, small and slanted and faded to brown in places, dated across the years 1958 through 1971. Amos had known the journal existed in the way a person knows a fact without ever having touched it. His father had mentioned his grandfather's chicken years once or twice in passing, but he had never held the book itself, and he sat with it open under the lamp for close to 2 hours, reading slower than he read anything else in his life, because his grandfather's hand was hard to make out, and because there was something in reading a dead man's daily accounts that made a person want to go carefully. Most of the entries were plain records, weather, planting dates, prices paid for feed, But scattered through the years 1966 to 1969, there was a run of entries about a chicken enterprise Eli Byler had apparently built almost entirely out of birds nobody else wanted. Cull cockerels from a hatchery near Millhaven that no longer existed by Amos's time. Birds bought for pennies and raised out slow on pasture and skim milk and whey from a neighboring cheese operation, then dressed and sold to a hotel kitchen in town that wanted a heavier, older-flavored bird than what the commercial packers were selling. One entry, dated the 3rd of May 1967, read plainly that he had taken 210 cull cockerels off the Hendricks place for $4 total, expecting to lose a fifth of them before summer, and expecting the rest to dress out heavier than anybody in town would believe of a bird that had started life headed for the incinerator. Below that entry, in the same hand but clearly written later, added almost as a note to whoever might read it after him, Eli Byler had written a single line that Amos read 4 times before he closed the book that night, and would read many more times before the year was out. Nothing is waste. Only things without their next job yet. Amos sat with that sentence a long while in the quiet of the front room, the lamp turned low, and he thought about the 300 birds settling into the milk house down the lane, and about his grandfather writing a line like that into a private ledger, with no way of knowing whether anyone would ever open the book again, let alone need what was in it. And Amos understood, in the plain, unshowy way he understood most important things, that his grandfather had written that sentence for exactly this, for someone 30 years unborn, standing at exactly this kind of crossroads, and that the writing of it had been an act of faith in a reader Eli Byler would never meet. He read on through the rest of the journal that week in the evenings, learning as much as he could of how his grandfather had built the pens, portable ones set on skids and moved across the pasture every few days, so the birds were never standing long in their own filth. How he had timed the whey deliveries from the Zook family's cheese house 2 miles over. How he had kept his mortality low by keeping the brooder dry and the flock size in each pen small enough that disease had nowhere close to spread, and how he had sold not to a broiler market that wanted young, tender meat cheap, but to buyers who wanted the older, denser, more flavorful bird that only slow raising could produce. None of it was complicated. All of it required patience, record-keeping, and a willingness to be doing something the rest of the county considered beneath the trouble. 3 things Amos had in reasonable supply, and had never before had a clear use for all at once. He spent the better part of 2 weeks in preparation before he let anyone in town know what he intended to do with the birds, working from his grandfather's sketches, which were rough but workable, drawings of a low pen frame, 10 feet by 12, open-floored, covered on top with wire and roofing tin. Light enough for one man to drag across a pasture by hand using a length of chain and a stout stick for leverage. Amos built 4 of them that spring with lumber salvaged from an old hog shed he had already been planning to tear down, and he set them up in the back pasture where the grass had gone thick and rank from 2 seasons of the dairy herd being smaller than it used to be. Ground, that was, in its own small way, also something the farm had written off as merely resting rather than working. He rode over to see Reuben Zook, the cheesemaker 2 miles east, whose family had been supplying his own grandfather's chickens with whey 60 years earlier, without either family quite remembering that connection, until Amos brought the journal along to show him, and the 2 men worked out an arrangement over coffee at Reuben's kitchen table, 40 gallons of whey a week, a byproduct of the Zook cheese operation that otherwise went to the hog trough or down the drain, in exchange for a share of the dressed birds come fall. An arrangement that cost neither man real cash and put a genuine use on something that had been treated as leftover for as long as either family could remember. Amos converted a corner of the old milk house into a brooder room, building a low wood-fired stove with a simple damper system that he could adjust by hand morning and night to hold a steady warmth without the temperature swings that killed young chicks faster than almost anything else, since a chick that gets chilled even once in its first week rarely recovers its full growth afterward. A fact Amos explained to nobody, because nobody asked him, but one he kept firmly in mind every time he banked the stove before bed. He ruled a new ledger the same width and the same hand-stitched binding as his grandfather's, and on the first page he copied out the line about waste and next jobs in his own handwriting beneath a blank space, the way a man leaves room on a headstone for a second name, and he began keeping his own dated entries starting the day the chicks arrived. Because if there was one thing 30 years and one dead grandfather had taught Amos Byler without either man ever meeting, it was that the ledger mattered more than the memory, since memory softened numbers over time, and a page in ink did not. The chicks themselves took over the first 6 weeks of his attention almost completely, on top of everything else 60 acres asked of a man alone, with a 10-year-old boy for help. He and Levi split the brooder watch between them, checking the stove every 4 hours around the clock for the first 10 days, refilling water founts that chilled quickly in the cool spring nights, watching for pasty vent, a common and often fatal blockage in young chicks that Amos treated the plain way his grandfather's journal described: warm water and a soft cloth. Nothing more complicated than that. He wrote his first entry on the 14th of April, 300 cockerels received, no charge beyond $11 in gas money, 400 pounds of cracked corn on hand, 200 pounds of chick starter mash, brooder holding at 95 degrees. It was around this same time, once word had gotten fully around Fenwick Mills that Amos Byler had hauled home a wagon load of hatchery culls and built pasture pens for them like they were something worth the lumber, that the feed store counter took the story up in earnest. Corley's Feed and Seed sat at the crossroads in the middle of town, and Hollis Corley, who had run it for 26 years, kept a pot of coffee going on the counter, and a bench along the front window that functioned, whether Hollis had ever intended it to or not, as the truest gossip exchange in the county. Dot Mabry, who ran the laundromat next door and came in most mornings for her coffee before opening up, was the one who first said out loud what half the county was already thinking, that Amos Byler had taken in the hatchery's garbage, and Wayne Pruitt, who farmed 200 acres of corn and beans on the far side of the creek, and had strong opinions about most things that were not his business, said he had heard it was worse than garbage, since a Leghorn Rock cross wasn't fit for laying, and wasn't bred for meat either. It was neither one thing nor the other, and Roy Tanner, who stopped in most mornings on his way to check his broiler houses, said the whole county would know by August whether Amos Byler could feed a rooster to a decent weight on skim milk and prayer, and that he personally would not be laying money on it. It was Wayne Pruitt who came up with the name that stuck, sitting on the bench with his coffee going lukewarm in his hand, calling the operation Byler's charity flock, on account of, as he put it, a man who took in what nobody else wanted and expected to make a living off it, was running a charity whether he called it one or not, and the name traveled through Fenwick Mills inside of a week the way names like that always do, repeated at the diner counter, and over fences, and at the feed store bench. Not cruel exactly, most of the men saying it would have denied meaning any real harm by it, but not kind either. The kind of joke a community tells about a man behind his back that it would never quite say to his face. And Amos, when it did eventually reach his face, by way of Levi repeating it at supper after hearing it from another boy at the school, said only that a name did not feed a bird one way or the other, and went back to his plate. The setbacks came honestly, and Amos recorded every one of them without softening a number, because his grandfather's journal had done the same, and Amos had decided early that a ledger that only recorded success was not a ledger at all, it was an advertisement. By the 1st of May, he had lost 31 chicks to a cold snap that caught the brooder stove low on wood 2 nights running. A loss he wrote down plainly, 31 dead, stove banked too low, correcting nothing about the number to make it sit easier. A hawk took 6 birds out of the second pasture pen over the course of 8 days before Amos figured out the wire on that particular pen had sagged enough at one corner to let a determined bird of prey work a gap, and he fixed the wire and lost none after that, noting the repair and the date beside the loss, the way his grandfather had always paired a problem with its solution, rather than leaving the problem standing alone on the page. By the middle of June, the flock stood at 241 birds out of the original 300, a loss of nearly 20%, which by the numbers in the county extension pamphlets Amos had picked up at Corley's, was actually a respectable mortality rate for cull stock of uncertain genetics, raised without antibiotics, though nobody at the feed store bench was reading those pamphlets closely enough to say so, and the number 241 was one Amos underlined twice in his ledger the night he tallied it, the only outward sign anyone would have seen, had anyone been watching, that the number meant something to him, beyond arithmetic. The first real evidence that the whole enterprise might amount to something came in the second week of July, when Amos caught and weighed a sample of 10 birds at 10 weeks old, a practice his grandfather's journal had described as the only honest way to know how a flock was doing, rather than guessing by eye, since a man's eye adjusted to what it saw every day, and stopped noticing changed the way a stranger's eye would. The 10 birds averaged 3 pounds 4 ounces live weight, heavier by a full ½ pound than what the Leghorn side of their breeding alone would have produced at that age, which confirmed what Amos had suspected on the hatchery dock back in April, that the accidental barred rock cross running through this cull batch, the very thing that had made the hatchery consider them doubly worthless, a mixed lot fit for nobody's program, was in fact carrying enough dual-purpose weight and vigor to make them a genuinely useful meat bird, raised out slow the old way, on pasture and way and time, rather than raised fast and cheap the modern way, on formulated feed under electric light. He wrote the weight down that night. 10 birds, average 3 pounds 4 ounces at 10 weeks, whey supplementation begun in earnest at week 6, and beside it, in a small hand, he wrote one more line that was not strictly a record of weight or feed, but was, for Amos, as close as he came that summer to celebrating anything. Not much. But not nothing either. He did not tell anyone at the feed store. He told Reuben Zook, because Reuben had a stake in the arrangement and deserved to know his way was doing its job, and Reuben said only that he wasn't surprised, and the two men sat on Reuben's porch a while, without saying much else, which between two plain men who trusted each other was itself a kind of celebration. It was the county extension office that brought the first outside verification, in the form of Marion Teague, a poultry health inspector, who came out in early August after Amos filed the paperwork required to sell dressed birds directly to the public under the state's custom-exempt processing rules, a modest license that let a small producer slaughter and sell a limited number of birds a year without the cost of a full commercial packing facility, provided the operation passed inspection for cleanliness and record-keeping. Marion Teague arrived expecting, by her own later admission, to spend 20 minutes confirming that a hobby flock met the bare minimum and be back in the truck before lunch, and instead spent close to 2 hours walking the pasture pens with Amos, asking questions about stocking density and rotation schedule that most producers half her career had never once been asked to answer with real numbers, and getting real numbers back every time. 12 birds per pen, moved to fresh grass every 3 days, mortality logged by date and cause, going back to the first week of brooding, whey intake recorded by the gallon. She examined the ledger itself for a long while, turning back several pages, and said that in 11 years of doing this work, she had inspected exactly 2 other small producers who kept records this complete, and neither of those had been keeping them by hand candlelight in April. Amos said the record-keeping wasn't his idea originally. It went back to his grandfather, and Marion Teague said that whoever had started it had done the operation a favor that was still paying out, and she signed off on his license that same visit, noting in her own report, a copy of which she left with Amos, that pasture density and rotation frequency on the Byler operation were well beyond what the minimum standard required and represented, in her professional opinion, a genuinely lower disease risk than most confinement operations she inspected that year, a sentence Amos read twice before filing it in the same drawer as his grandfather's journal, because it was, in its own bureaucratic language, an answer to a question nobody at Corley's Feed and Seed had thought to ask yet. That answer arrived for the whole county in a harder and less welcome form the following spring. In March of the second year, when a highly pathogenic strain of avian influenza moved through the commercial poultry operations of 3 neighboring counties before reaching Ashcombe County itself. Carried, the state veterinarians eventually concluded, on the boots and equipment shared between large confinement operations and on the wild waterfowl that passed through the region's grain fields every spring migration. The disease moved fastest and hit hardest in exactly the kind of operation Roy Tanner ran. Tens of thousands of birds packed at high density inside enclosed houses where one infected bird could spread the virus through an entire flock within days. And by the second week of the outbreak, the state had ordered mandatory testing and, where the virus was confirmed, mandatory culling of entire flocks regardless of how many birds in that flock might still have been healthy. A policy that existed because the disease moved too fast and too invisibly for anything less blunt to contain it. Tanner broilers tested positive in its second house on the 19th of March, and by the following week, all three of Roy Tanner's houses, close to 60,000 birds total, were gone, culled under state order. The smoke from the disposal pits visible from the county road for 2 days running. A sight several people at Corley's Feed and Seed described afterward in low voices, since it was not the kind of thing anyone in Fenwick Mills wanted to be caught joking about. Vandermeer Hatchery lost its own breeding flock the same week and shut down egg production for a month. Amos Baylor's flock, by contrast, spread across low-density pasture pens, moved every 3 days, with birds never sharing housing with any other flock and visitors required, by a rule Amos had copied straight out of his grandfather's journal and enforced without exception, to wash their boots in a bleach tray at the end of the lane before walking any farther onto the property, tested clean when Marion Teague came through with the state's mandatory countywide testing crew, and tested clean again 3 weeks later on the follow-up round. It was, as more than one person in town eventually put it, plainly visible from the road. On one side of the county, a string of shuttered broiler houses with biohazard notices taped to the gates, and on the other side, a scatter of small wire pens moving steadily across green pasture with chickens in them, alive, eating, entirely unremarkable, except for the fact that at that particular moment, they were nearly the only chickens left producing meat in Ashcombe County. The gossip at Corley's Feed and Seed changed its language within a week of the testing results becoming public, the way a community's opinion of a man tends to move only after the facts have moved first, and never a day before. Dot Mabry, who had been among the first to call it garbage the previous spring, said at the counter one morning that she had bought 2 dressed birds from Amos Byler for Sunday dinner, and it was the best chicken she had eaten in years. Dense and flavorful in a way the store-bought kind wasn't anymore. And Wayne Pruitt, pressed on the matter by Hollis Corley, allowed that whatever Amos was doing out there, charity was clearly the wrong word for it now, and that maybe it never had been the right word, though he stopped short of saying he'd been wrong outright, which nobody at the bench really expected of Wayne Pruitt anyway. Roy Tanner did not come by the feed store for the better part of 3 weeks after his flocks were culled, and when he did finally show up again, thinner in the face than anyone remembered him, he drove out to the Byler farm on a Saturday afternoon instead, parking his truck at the end of the lane and walking up past the pasture pens on foot. Pausing at the bleach tray, Amos had set out at the gate before stepping through it without being asked. He found Amos moving one of the pens across fresh grass, and he stood watching a while before he spoke, and when he did speak, it was not a long speech, since Roy Tanner had never in his life needed many words to say what he meant, and did not reach for more of them now. He said he was wrong about the birds. And about Amos. Amos set the pen down and straightened up, and he did not smile and he did not gloat, because there was nothing in him that wanted to make a hard moment harder, for a man who had just watched 60,000 birds go into a pit, and what he said back was that Roy Tanner had been working from what he could see at the time, which was a broiler house that worked, right up until the week it didn't, and that there had been no way to see the rest of it from where Tanner had been standing. Roy Tanner asked, after a silence that ran on longer than either man seemed to mind, whether Amos would be willing to walk him through how the pasture rotation worked. And Amos said he would, and the two of them spent the better part of an hour doing exactly that, with Roy Tanner asking the kind of specific, humbled questions a man asks when he has decided to actually learn something, rather than merely be seen agreeing with it. The economic proof came a month after that, in the form of a phone call Amos received at the shanty phone at the end of his lane, relayed by Levi, who had taken to checking the machine most afternoons since the county's poultry story had started drawing outside interest. Priya Nayar, a regional sourcing buyer for Holloway's Markets, a chain of natural foods grocers spread across 4 states, had read a short piece the county extension office had put out about disease resilience in low-density pasture operations during the outbreak, and had driven out to Fenwick Mills herself to see the Byler farm before offering anything in writing, since she had learned the hard way in her line of work that press release farming rarely survived a site visit. She walked the pasture with Amos for the better part of 2 hours, tasted a sample bird Amos had dressed for her that same morning, and reviewed the ledger going back to the first entry in April of the year before, and she told Amos plainly that the flavor and texture of a bird raised slow on pasture and whey was exactly the kind of product her chain's customers were willing to pay a real premium for, and that she wanted to discuss a standing weekly order. She proposed a volume, at the outset, considerably larger than what Amos's current operation could supply without expanding well past what he believed he could still manage carefully with one boy and his own 2 hands, and Amos told her so directly that he would rather supply her a smaller, steady number every week that he could stand behind completely than a larger number that would force him to cut corners on the pasture rotation or the record-keeping that had gotten the birds this far in the first place. Priya Nayar did not argue the point, and the contract they signed that summer called for 120 dressed birds a week, at a price that, once totaled across a full year alongside his existing local sales through Corley's and the hotel restaurant in town, put the operation's annual revenue past $110,000, a number Amos wrote into his ledger without comment beyond the figure itself and the date, since a number like that, to a man raised the way Amos had been raised, was worth recording plainly and not worth crowing over. By the fall of that second year, the ripple had spread well past the Byler farm on its own, the way a genuinely useful method tends to spread through a small community once the proof of it has been sitting out in plain sight long enough. Ivan Stoltzfus, the 15-year-old son of a neighboring Amish family, who had been helping Amos with the pasture pens 2 afternoons a week since the previous summer, started his own flock of 40 cull birds that fall, bought off Vandermeer Hatchery at the same nominal rate Amos had paid, using pens built to Eli Byler's old design, copied out of Amos's own ledger, and 2 more Amish families down the road put in orders with the hatchery for cull stock before the season was out. Once word traveled that there was a real, provable way to turn birds nobody wanted into a modest and dependable income. Roy Tanner, rebuilding slower and smaller than before, converted one of his 3 houses into an open, lower-density pasture setup based on what Amos had shown him that Saturday afternoon, and told Hollis Corley at the feed store counter, without being asked, that it was the best decision he had made in 20 years of raising chickens, a sentence that traveled the bench inside a day, the same way Byler's charity flock once had, except this time the traveling word carried something closer to respect than mockery. It was Levi who asked the question that closed the loop that Amos had, without quite planning it, been waiting all along for someone to ask. The boy was helping his father copy that year's final tallies into the ledger one evening in November, sitting across the kitchen table by lamplight, when he came across his great-grandfather's old entry about waste and next jobs, the same page Amos had shown him once before, and Levi asked why a man would bother writing something down so carefully if he had no way of knowing whether anybody would ever read it. Amos thought about the question longer than most of the questions Levi asked him, and then he said that a man wrote a thing down carefully for exactly that reason, so that somebody would, someday, whether he ever got to know who that somebody was or not, and that the writing itself was the only part a person ever really had control over. Levi turned that answer over for a moment, the way his father did with most things, and then he asked whether Amos was going to write something of his own into the book, and Amos said that he already had, and he turned back a few pages to show him. Beneath his grandfather's original line, in his own steady hand, dated the 14th of November of that second year, Amos had written that nothing was waste, only things without their next job yet, and that sometimes a body had to lose everything it thought it understood about a thing before it could see what the thing's next job actually was, and that he hoped whoever read this page next, whether that was Levi or somebody neither of them had met yet, would remember that a written page could wait a long time for the right reader, and never once stop being true while it waited. The next morning Amos rose before first light, the way he had every morning for close to 2 years now, dressed in the dark, and walked down the lane past the 4 pasture pens, now expanded to 11, toward the brooder room in the old milk house to check the stove and see how the newest batch of cull chicks, 40 of them this time, from a different hatchery 2 counties over that had heard about Amos through Marion Teague's office, had made it through the night. Red, the rooster his grandfather's old cross had eventually produced as sire for the whole operation's 2nd generation, a heavy-shouldered bird with a temper Amos had learned to work around rather than fight, crowed once from his own separate pen as Amos passed, the same way he crowed every morning, and Amos paused just long enough to check the latch on Red's gate before going on to the brooder room, because there was a fire to bank and water founts to check and a full ordinary day of farm work waiting on the other side of the door, the same as there had been the day before, and the day before that, and every day since a hatchery had decided 300 birds weren't worth the diesel to haul them away. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the thing sitting in their own yard isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever taken in something everybody else had already given up on and made something steady and real out of it, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.